Hey, CIR. I'm Ryan Smith. I'm one of our broker delegates, and I'm here today with our broker, Stephen Phillips, and Ryan Iannone from Mortgage Connection. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this foreign home buyers ban. Now, we want to put a bit of a different spin on this presentation. There's been a lot of sort of negative press and a lot of, negative connotation around this legislation. And let's be honest, I mean, it certainly does restrict somebody's ability to purchase property in Canada if they fall into a certain category or classification, which we're going to talk about. But one of the things that Steve and I were talking about recently was, I think there's a real opportunity here where if an agent understands the legislation really, really well, and they understand their client's position really, really well, it's not a matter of trying to look for ways around the law. That's not the goal here. But if you understand the law really well, there is potentially opportunity to help your clients purchase properties and still be in compliance with the law.
Right. And the conversation exactly was that, is like all the communication has been around the ban, but foreign buyers can still buy in Alberta. And that's where there is opportunity. Now, you have to abide by the act and the regulations, because there's some pretty hefty fines that come along with it. So definitely make sure you understand your buyer's position, but there's huge opportunity for those that still want to buy outside of the exemption.
And Steve's going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about a piece or a form that CREA put out. This piece that CREA put out came out, I think, in late December. I think it was right before Christmas when the regulations came out. And it's basically a consent form that you can have your client sign. And we would highly recommend as a brokerage, I mean, if you're working with a client and you know that they may be subject to these restrictions, we would highly, encourage you to have this consent form filled out and signed by the buyer before moving forward with that purchase. And the reason behind that is they've built into the legislation some mechanisms for fines. Now, the way that it's worded in the legislation, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but I want to say it's anyone who aids or abets knowingly or unknowingly with the purchase of a residential property to somebody who is subject of this ban is potentially liable for a $10,000 fine. And that's kind of the scary part as far as real estate agents are concerned. And in fairness, there's a lot of trepidation, and we'll hear from Ryan on the mortgage industry here in just a minute as well. But I know that as a brokerage, we've been encouraging all of you who are working with clients who you're unsure whether or not they're subject to this ban or not, to reach out and get some legal advice. And I know that some of the answers you're getting from the law community are a little bit vague as well. We've had Jeff Kahane on a couple times now to do a couple different pieces on this. Everybody's still working through this. We're only a couple months into this. Now, hopefully, we only have to deal with it for 2 years in total, because that's the way the legislation was drafted. It remains to be seen what happens at the end of 2024. But hopefully this law will be off the books. And in the meantime, it's a matter of us educating you as much as a brokerage, as much as we possibly can to get you the information you need to help your clients. So I just want to shift gears here before I get into a little bit of a presentation about how these rules apply. We wanted to invite Ryan in just to talk about some of the things you're seeing on the lending side. And I know sort of in preparation for this conversation, we were talking about, you're seeing a real limitation on people who are coming into the country on a work permit where you didn't have a limitation before. I think the other thing you said, Ryan, is you're getting a lot of questions from realtors, but it's important to stress that this isn't a law to restrict financing. Okay. So what types of things are you seeing on your side?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with that. The biggest thing that I would like to tell everyone is this is not a financing thing. This is everybody. So we have a lot of people that are reaching out, asking us questions. This affects realtors. This affects lawyers, everybody. So we should all understand this as much as we possibly can. It affects the financing side in a bigger way with the work permits. So we don't do a lot of actual foreign buyers. I live in another country. I make my money in Dubai. I'm going to buy in Canada. We don't do a ton of that, but what we do is a lot of new to Canada where people have their work permit. That was the biggest change, because what they did is they took it away and said, you can be on a work permit, but you have to be in Canada for minimum 3 years. You have to work in Canada for 3 years, claim your taxes for a minimum of 3 of the last 4 years, and then you can buy. Where before, example being someone coming from the US literally could buy within a day or two of coming up here on a work permit. So that was the biggest change. That changed that program completely on what we can do. So now you have to have your PR when you get to Canada if you want to buy before that 3 years is up.
Okay.
It's interesting because one of the things that you said and you've also said is we're all responsible for finding out our client's position, and it is an industry thing. And one of the things I live by is like, I don't know everything, but I can find out anything. And that's just asking the right questions. And if we keep asking questions, you keep uncovering stuff, then it gives us those breadcrumbs to follow. And I think because of the lack of direction that we've had from the government,
It was bad.
terrible. So we just keep asking those questions and follow the breadcrumbs. And it is ultimately on the buyers to provide us with those information, the correct information, which is why we have indemnity clauses in the buyer brokerage agreements. But we have to ask the right questions and work with our mortgage brokers and our lawyers and everybody else to find those breadcrumbs.
Well, so I want to come back. I'm going to go through a little bit of, okay, I guess, how do we get to this point in time? And then I want to come back and ask you a bit more about the breadcrumbs and a bit more about what you see as a broker that agents can do to protect themselves. You know, again, I want to talk about the consent form that we discussed before with respect to Korea. So you stew on that, and I'm going to kind of bring everybody kind of up to speed on how we got here in the first place. So as Ryan said, this was all kind of rolled out in a bit of a shambles. So to sort of take everybody back, the federal government put their budget out. I want to say it was probably March or April of last year. One of the big pushes in that federal budget was to make housing more affordable for Canadians. And there was a bunch of policies that were sort of pitched or proposed within that budget, one of which was this ban on foreign ownership. The idea behind it was, according to the federal government, if you could restrict foreign ownership, you would therefore increase housing supply, which would then reduce prices and make housing more affordable. I don't know if this will have any material effect, but it is what it is, and here we are.
Okay, jump in. So my favorite story about foreign ownership is talking to a VP at a major bank across Canada. They were told a story about a lady from South Korea that came to Toronto. She ordered a car for the day. She got in the car with her son. They drove to about 25 properties in Toronto. They would pull up to the property. She'd get on her phone. Yep. Click. Nope. Yep. Bought 18 properties that day.
Wow.
So that.
Did she have an agent with her, right?
No.
Oh.
I think she had the agent on the phone.
Fair.
Is my guess. All cash, right? 18 properties that day. So I understand that part of it, how big that is. I mean, in Calgary, in Alberta, is that a big thing? But we tend to, our rules tend to go national, even though it might only be Toronto and Vancouver that they're trying to slow down. Right. But that's my favorite story that I like to tell all the time. 18 properties, one day, pick up the phone. Yep. Nope. Yeah.
But that could also be like the perfect example. So Toronto and Vancouver are definitely the cause of this.
Yes.
But the opportunity for Alberta is we likely have a lot more areas that fall out of these metropolitan areas. And what's the other one?
Census agglomeration.
I don't know that word escapes me.
I was calling it amalgamation for the longest. It's not. It's an English liberation. Yes.
Yeah, but we might have more opportunity to actually have those foreign buyers buy here, is where the more condensed population areas of Greater Toronto and Greater Vancouver aren't going to have that opportunity.
So with that in mind, so back in June, after the budget came out, the government put out this act, which at that time, or still is on the books, is called the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act. We all refer to it as the Canadian Foreign Home Buyer Ban or something similar. And it wasn't until late December that we finally got the regulations, which gave some context around this. So then it's been a mad rush over the past 2 months to try to get a sense of how all of this is going to impact the market, get this information out to everybody at the brokerage. Like I said before, we've had Jeff Kahane from Kahane Law on a couple times to talk about it. So all that said, that's kind of what's brought us to today. So I want to sort of set the table as we go through the rest of this conversation and encourage agents to sort of look at this from two perspectives. Number one, you have the perspective of the property that somebody is trying to purchase, and we'll talk about the definition of, what the property is as far as the act is concerned. And then number two, you have the people who are trying to purchase the property. So we'll get to that separately or secondly. But as it pertains to the property, I just want to read a couple things here just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the ban applies to residential property. And within the Act and the regulation, they have defined residential property as a detached house or a similar building of 1 to 3 dwelling units. Now, they go on to say that a dwelling unit means it's a residential unit that contains private kitchen facilities, a private bath, and a private living area. Now, I just want to stop there because I know that we in Alberta tend to look at our license classification system under RECA, and we view a residential license as you can sell 4 units or 4 properties as part of one transaction, and that's a residential transaction. As soon as it's 5 or more, it becomes a commercial transaction. This legislation has nothing to do with RECA. It has nothing to do with your license classification in Alberta. It is universal legislation for the entire country. The definition that they chose to go with was a residential dwelling of 3 units or less is considered a residential property. So the opportunity that exists there is if you have an investor client who is a foreigner and they want to buy a 4-plex, they can do that under the Act. Now, again, we'll talk about the consent to purchase and all these different types of things. But Steve, I think there's a real opportunity there for agents to look at the properties that clients are purchasing and determine if it falls into this bucket or not.
Definitely. Multifamily is another opportunity there, which they probably would have been wise if they wanted to slow down foreign investment to lump that in there, because then they're just going to control more properties. But
right,
it's outside of the exemptions.
Well, and so the legislation goes on to say, so again, residential property is detached as what I read. Residential property is defined as what I read previously.
I'm curious about the private bath.
Why are you curious about the private bath?
Well, there's another loophole.
Well, talk to your broker if you have any questions about private baths. So the second part of this is it could be a part of a building that's a semi-detached house, a row house unit, a residential condominium unit, or other similar premises. And then it goes on to say that it's reasonably necessary for its use and enjoyment as a place of residence for individuals. Now, I bring this up because we've had a lot of questions from our agents in the Canmore market, and the Canmore market is a very, very unique market. We have a lot of hotel rentals, different zoning, tourist zoning, different things that apply. And I know that there were a lot of questions around whether or not a property is going to be, if it will fall under the scope of this ban if it's a hotel property. Now, again, we encourage anybody who works in the Canmore market to seek legal advice on that. In speaking with Jeff DeHane, most recently, I know he spoke to a litigator that he does a lot of business with. The litigator said, look, until we have a court case that deals with this and until we have some precedent on this, it's basically impossible to say. But I think the litigator was sort of arguing to the standpoint of, reasonably necessary for its use and enjoyment as a place of residence for individuals. The ban has nothing to do with zoning per se.
Right.
And so the advice that we've been given, at least for now, is that these hotel accommodation or hotel style accommodations will fall into the scope of the ban, right? Now, the other thing that the legislation goes on to say is that land that does not contain any habitable dwelling but is zoned for residential or use or mixed use is also captured under the ban. So if it's raw land, but if it's zoned for residential use or mixed use, it is also underneath the ban. But one of the big takeaways, and Steve alluded to this already, is that all of these properties and the definition that I've just given you of residential and the land and all that stuff, these are for properties that are located inside of what they're calling a census metropolitan area or a census agglomeration. Now, Ryan, you have a really fancy map for this that you were showing me the other day. So just maybe if you could talk a little bit about the mapping tool that you were using. And I know we're not looking at a live demo of it right now, but if you could just give us a little background.
Yeah, so it's on StatsCan.
Okay.
And basically, and I'm going to be honest, it took me about 45 minutes to find it the second time I was looking for it. And basically what I do is you can put in a town or a postal code and it'll tell you what it is. It'll tell you if it's one of them or if it's something else. So it's that simple. Put in the town name, so Strathmore. You think Strathmore, smaller town, but when you put all the surrounding areas, it becomes an agglomeration.
Right.
So it's a StatsCan page somewhere. We can share it. We can get it.
I think we'll get that link in the business tools on the virtual office.
Yeah. So you just type it in and it tells you exactly what it is. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and based on your research, and again, I understand you're not an expert on this, but this ban impacts your industry, your business in the same way that it impacts the business of our agents. So based on your research, quick synopsis, what's a census metropolitan area or census agglomeration? What are the things based on?
The metropolitan was definitely bigger areas. So I'd say surrounding area in a city, I think it was 100,000.
Okay.
Is I think what it was. And an agglomeration, I think, was 25.
Okay.
So, but that's the census. So if you take Strathmore, I just know because I looked it up. Strathmore's not 25, but when you take all the surrounding areas around it that they include as a part of Strathmore, it's over 25.
Right.
So that's the two numbers that I remember.
Well, and your industry might have done the same thing. We were given some mapping tools very early on. Like it was probably late December when this stuff came out, maybe very early into the new year. They're awful to look at because there's no definition on the map. I mean, if the property you're looking at is smack dab in the middle of Calgary, yeah, it falls under the ban, right? Aren't? Then potentially you can find deals, quite frankly, for clients who are being told by other agents, well, no, you're a foreign person, you can't buy a property.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
When do you want to get me into this?
Sure, go into it right now. So Steve has a copy here, and again, we'll make this available on the virtual office. But Steve has a copy here of this certificate of consent of purchaser form that was put out by CREA. So now it's probably a good time to introduce it.
Well, and all it really says is that they're aware and understand the restrictions of the foreign buyer ban, and it is our job to educate these people and ask the right questions. So it goes through and they acknowledge that they're aware and that they are capable of purchasing. But one of the things, if we're ever unsure, I mean, we can get it so far, and this goes back to working with the lawyers and the mortgage brokers, but if you're ever unsure, just put in the conditions subject to the lawyer's review and approval. And then we get some due diligence period on the contract. And I don't think a mortgage broker is going to red flag that as far as a condition or a term. And then getting the lawyers to just do a final legal review. And then that covers everybody's rear ends to make sure that everything goes through. Because the last thing we want to do is put a deal together where it doesn't come together or there's further legal complications.
Right.
I think we all have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Well, and I want to get into some of these exemptions that they've created now, but you're 100% right. I mean, we're getting questions regularly through Quick Connect, and I understand why. I mean, our agents are out there, they're doing transactions, the market's starting to pick up. A lot of our agents, or a certain population of our agents, they service a lot of people from communities of people that are coming from other places, newcomers to Canada, right? So they have questions about, does my client qualify for one of these exemptions? The challenge that we have as a brokerage is, and this goes back to your point, is I may not know the answer, but I can find out. Some of these exemptions are so specific in how they are written, and they reference other pieces of legislation. And quite frankly, as a broker delegate or part of our management team, I'm not familiar with all of these different pieces of legislation. So it's next to impossible for me to accurately answer a question that comes in from an agent.
Well, I mean, it goes back to foreign buyers have never been able to buy more than, was it 7 acres?
I want to say it's 20, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, but so see, I mean, it's impossible to know all of this stuff and keep it top of mind when it only comes up once every few years. But it's easy to find out. So it's understanding what questions to ask and asking those questions, and then just seeking more advice and seeking out your legal partners, your mortgage brokers, and working together to get this done.
Right. Now, okay, so let's talk about, so we talked about bucket number one, which is the property. So we talked about properties that are exempt from the legislation as far as that's concerned. So let's talk about the people or the persons that are purchasing the property. So number one, I think most people are aware and on board with the fact that this legislation does not apply to Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or people who are registered as Indigenous under the Indian Act. Now, from a brokerage perspective, Steve, have we offered any guidance, or would you recommend any due diligence on behalf of an agent when it comes to, and I'm just going to reference FinTrack, would it behoove a real estate agent to ask for somebody's passport instead of asking for their driver's license, for example?
We didn't talk about this question before recording, Ryan.
Okay. You're not tough questions, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, it definitely wouldn't hurt. If you get a government-issued ID that is national, you're probably going to get more information than just a provincial license.
Right.
And even then, and you probably run into this as well, but having a permanent residence card or something like that gives you a little bit more information.
Right.
And people, I don't know about you, but when I had clients that were selling and they had the opportunity to pull out their firearms license because they never get to show it.
They like to get that out.
So people with a more rare ID tend to like to use that ID too.
Well, and the reason I guess I asked the question about the passport is twofold. is that, a passport should, to the best of my understanding, be proof that somebody is a Canadian citizen.
Yeah.
Now, this question has come through Quick Connect a few times about, well, my client has a driver's license in Alberta. Well, I can promise you, because I used to do road tests for anybody who doesn't know. I used to take people their driver's licenses. So I know you can get a driver's license in Alberta and not be either a permanent resident or a citizen of Canada.
Yeah.
That's a completely different jurisdictional piece of identification. So just because somebody has a driver's license does not mean they're a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident.
But talking about those breadcrumbs again, that's a really good breadcrumb, because if they have a passport from another country, then you go to ask, how long have you been in Canada?
Right. Okay. So let's talk about some of these other exemptions. So again, that list that we just gave is intended to be the people that are exempt from this legislation. Now, other exemptions that they've created, and this is where it gets very technical, and this is what I was saying before about the language that's included in the regulation and the act. As a broker delegate team, as a management team, as a brokerage, it's almost impossible for us to have the answers to some of these questions. So here we go. So some of the exemptions that exist. A person who is enrolled in a program of authorized study at a designated learning institution as defined in Section 211.1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protections Regulations. Then second to that, they have to have filed all required income tax returns under the Income Tax Act for each of the 5 previous taxation years. And they have to be physically present in Canada for a minimum of 244 days in each of the 5 calendar years that precede the purchase. So again, you may ask a question and say, well, my client has a student visa. Can they purchase a property? And my answer as a broker delegate is going to be, I have no idea, because I don't know if they meet all of these criteria. These situations are so specific to the individual that you're going to have to research it independently. You're going to have to get legal advice. You may have to get immigration advice to figure out if their student visa actually falls into the criteria that's provided here. It's extremely complicated. We appreciate that it's extremely complicated. That's why we're doing our best to roll out as much information as we can, knowing that there's limitations with how we can advise you as an agent, because we just don't have all of this information in front of us. Now, again, the opportunity that exists here, and that's what we want to talk about, is if you're prepared to go out and, like Steve said, look for the breadcrumbs, verify the information, protect yourself as much as possible with this type of a consent form. I think that there is an opportunity to help certain people purchase property, but they have to meet some very, very specific criteria. Anything you guys want to add to that, or is that something pretty good?
Can't get financing for student visas.
Say that again, Ryan.
You can't get financing on a student visa.
Okay, so if somebody's a student in Canada, they can't. There's no way they can get financing.
No, so they might qualify for that exemption, but we can't get financing.
Right. But chances are in your channels, I guess if somebody's on a student visa, they're looking at a cash purchase. And
Mom and dad are probably paying for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Fair enough. Another exemption that exists here, and again, I'm going to read it all in its entirety. I know it's a lot of information, and this speaks to the work permits that you were talking about before, and I want you to chime in after I kind of go through this. But so another exemption that exists is for people that hold a work permit as defined in Section 2 of the Immigration and Refugee Protections Regulations, or are authorized to work in Canada under Section 186 of those regulations. They have to have worked in Canada for a minimum period of 3 years within the 4 years preceding the year in which they were purchasing it. If the work is full-time work as defined in subsection 73.1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, and they have to have filed all required income tax returns under the Income Tax Act for a minimum of 3 of the 4 taxation years preceding the year in which they're making the purchase.
Charlie Brown's teacher. That's all I heard.
It's a lot of words.
Yeah. It's so that this, if we go back to it, the work permits we used to be able to all day, every day, no problem. It was a specific new to Canada program that we still use for people that are on their PRs as well. But what they did is they fundamentally changed the work permit by adding all of that 3 years, full-time position, stuff like that. So we used to be able to get someone from the U.S. move into Canada. We pulled our U.S. credit bureau. They're on a work permit. Done. Get it done right away. Someone could come from pretty much anywhere else in the world, be here 10% down, be here for 6 months on a work permit. Done. Get the deal done. Now we run into this, 3 years. 3 years of taxes, 3 years in Canada of the last 4 years. I'm working on one right now where they were only in Canada for 2 years of the 3 years ago. So does that count? I don't know. So when they rolled this out, it was, once again, go back a little bit, this was the one rule that was in there that shocked the finance side. We all expected the foreign buyer, but we didn't really look at work permits as foreign buyers.
Right.
We looked at them as people that were trying to be Canadian, and when they put that in, it changed it significantly. So we're still trying to figure that out as well.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking, I've had a question come in on Quick Connect from one of our agents who said, my clients have applied for permanent residency. I believe that they were in the process. I don't know if they actually had been granted permanent residency, but it was in the works. And it's like, well, does my client, can they buy a property or not? Well, again, the letter of the law says you need to be a permanent resident.
Until it's approved.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing with PRs is, they could take, some people get here with their PRs. Some people, it takes them 3 or 4 years. They apply for it and it takes forever.
Right.
So,
Depends where they're coming from.
yeah, exactly, right? So they have that work permit. They've applied for it, but they can't do anything until it gets approved. And that sometimes takes years.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
So,
Okay, I gotta read, I won't read all of the information that I have on here, but I'm just gonna highlight a couple other exemptions that exist. So somebody who is a representative of a foreign government, they're probably gonna be exempt from this. So if the Councillor of Ireland wants to buy a property in Canada, they can probably buy it now. If you're working with the Councillor of Ireland, fact check everything I just said.
Do you politically exposed person?
Well, do your politically exposed person fit track. That'll come. Man, there's a lot of regulations in this industry. That's why Steve's here. So also exempt are foreign nationals with valid temporary residence status whose temporary residence visa was issued under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And then the second part of that is persons that have made a claim for refugee protection in accordance with subsection 99(3) of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, if that claim has been found eligible and referred to the Refugee Protection Division under subsection 101 of that act. Now, I bring this up specifically to dealing with conflict in Ukraine, and I recognize that Ukraine is not the only part of the world that is dealing with hardship, conflict, all these types of things. I realize it's more front and center in the news media right now, which is why I bring it up. We've also had a question that came in from one of our agents about what was called a CUAET, which was a Canadian or a Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. And the question was, if my client has this, can they buy a house? The answer is, I have no idea. You're going to need an immigration lawyer to weigh in on this, and do they meet the requirements of the legislation as an exemption? It is such a case-by-case specific situation that you're going to be dealing with as an agent. Now, again, if you work with a lot of folks from a specific country or in a specific nationality or a specific subset, you may learn these rules inside and out, which I think there's the opportunity that we keep going back to, is to put yourself leaps and bounds ahead of your competition, because you know this stuff better than anybody. You know what people do need in order to purchase properties coming from other countries. And I think that there's a real opportunity there that you can capitalize on.
Yeah, I agree. But you have to know it inside and out. This isn't something you're just going to dip your toe into and see if it works. You have to know this stuff if you're going down this road. And partnering with a good immigration lawyer, I think, would be a really good idea if this is actually a strategy you can utilize in your business.
Absolutely. Do you guys have any other advice, thoughts, anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up the conversation?
I don't think so. Like the foreign buyer programs that we have for actual financing hasn't changed. It's just a matter of, do they fit under the foreign buyer ban?
Right.
If they do, we can still get financing.
Right.
Yep. So,
And from the brokerage standpoint, I just can't reiterate enough. Do your due diligence, know this stuff inside and out if this is something you're going to go with, and reach out, ask questions, keep asking questions.
And to piggyback off the back of that, keep asking questions, but understand the complexity of this and understand the limitations that we are all working under and trying to understand and interpret this legislation. As we get, hopefully, some more clarity on this, we'll continue to roll it out to you as best we can. But understand that some of your questions that you ask on Quick Connect, they're incredibly good questions, but we may be referring you to a lawyer or an immigration lawyer or somebody with a specialized skill set that can help your clients navigate this information.
Definitely.
and I think if anybody has wins, if you have wins in this, share.
Yeah, that's
right.
a great point, right?
Like on it, we talk about that within our team and all the time. If you run into a situation and you win and you come out with a good or bad, either way, share.
Yeah.
So that when that next, because someone else is going to run into it,
Yeah.
let us know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Collaboration is key.
100%. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, listen, thanks, gentlemen. I appreciate your time, and hopefully that gives you a little bit more information about the prohibition on foreign home ownership. Thanks, guys.
Buddy.
Thank you.